Welcome everyone. My name is Stuart Price. I'm the academic director of the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk and a professor of philosophy here in Cambridge. Welcome to this event, which is, among other things, the latest in a series of monthly research seminars that CSER has been running this year. And we have a very distinguished visitor to deliver this seminar for us. To introduce him, I'm going to introduce Professor Zubin Rami, from the Machine Learning Institute in the Faculty of Engineering, who's somebody that we've recently become involved with in CSER in our projects to direct more attention to issues of safety and benefits in artificial intelligence, the kind of topics that Professor Russell is going to be talking about. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Zubin.
Great, thanks you. I'm delighted to be here introducing Stuart Russell, who is Professor of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at the University of California at Berkeley, and formerly chair of that tremendously important department in computer science. He has a background in physics from Oxford and then went to Stanford to study computer science and seems to have stayed in at Berkeley since then, although he did spend a couple of very enjoyable years, I believe, in Paris as a Chair Blaise Pascal in Paris, and visits here frequently, it seems, which is great. Stuart has won a number of awards for his highly influential work in artificial intelligence and probabilistic reasoning, in limited rationality, machine learning, and many other areas, including important applications to fields like global seismic monitoring. His awards include awards from the National Science Foundation, the Computers and Thought Award, awards from the International Society for Bayesian Analysis, and the American Statistical Association. And it's a great pleasure to have him here, in particular for this series of lectures, because he's been most recently tremendously influential in bringing the discussion of the future of artificial intelligence into a wider academic community of people who actually work in artificial intelligence, like Stuart. And I think that's important, because that discussion needs to be something that's not just in the public and in science fiction, but in academic circles of people who work in that particular area. So it's a great pleasure to have him here, and we welcome him. So, thanks.
So, thank you very much, Zubin, and thank you, Hugh, for organizing the meeting. So for some of you, this will be deja vu if you were at the Puerto Rico meeting or a AAAI in January. There are a few new wrinkles that have been added. For some of you, it'll be new, I hope. So this is something I've been thinking about for a long time. The first edition of my textbook back in '94 actually has a section titled, What If We Succeed? And I thought it was important to have that discussion because the field seemed not to ever think about the possibility. I think having labored for decades and made not very much progress, people had almost stopped thinking about what it would be like if we succeeded. But I got the idea for the chapter from David Lodge, who wrote a book called Trading Places and another one called Small World, about a young English academic who ends up going to a place he calls Euphoria State, which is a thinly disguised version of Berkeley, from Birmingham, which is called Rummage in the book, but it's obviously Birmingham where David Lodge teaches. And by coincidence, David Lodge, when we used to live in Birmingham, David Lodge bought the house that we lived in when we moved out. So a number of coincidences has made me want to read his books, and in one of the books the young protagonist asks a very distinguished panel of literary theorists, what if you were right? And none of them had ever thought about this possibility before. So that's how I got the idea for the title of that chapter, What If We Were to Succeed? Okay, so AI is about making computers intelligent. We all agree with that. And I think there's now a fairly broad consensus that what we mean by that is not so much does the thought process have to mimic the thought processes of humans, or does the thought process have to follow some laws of intelligence, but really, can we get the computer to do the right thing? And the means of doing the internal processes sort of follow from that, and there can be many ways of doing the right thing. And what we mean by doing the right thing, very crudely, and I'm not going to make any sophisticated points that would impress any economists or philosophers in the audience, but let's just say for the time being that what it means is maximizing the expected value over the entire future of some measure of how happy we should all be with the outcome. So maximizing expected utility. This is a very standard formula, and so that's what we generally mean by saying that the computer is doing the right thing. And this can be specialized in all kinds of ways, to talk about speech acts, to talk about machine learning systems that classify objects, they're making decisions about what kind of object it is, to robots, and so on. Lots of different ways of using the same basic theoretical framework. And so why are we doing this? Well, initially it's just incredibly fascinating to think that we might understand intelligence well enough to be able to actually create something that was intelligent. And obviously, the more intelligent, the better. This doesn't seem to need much debate. And we do believe we can succeed. I think there are those who say, well, there's no need to worry about the future because we'll never reach this future where AI has succeeded. I'm not sure that those people are being completely honest. It doesn't seem to make sense to work on a research problem that you believe is not solvable. And it also seems rather, so if you draw the analogy to the doomsday prophets are saying that AI is sort of driving the car of the human race along a road that leads straight off the cliff. Well, the people who will say we'll never succeed are like the people who say, well, that's fine, we'll just continue heading for the cliff and we'll just hope that we run out of gas before we get there. That doesn't seem a very prudent strategy either. So let's work on the assumption that we will succeed. And it's a very difficult problem. I'm not going to say that we're going to succeed in any particular amount of time because I know that I'll then be quoted in the newspapers and I don't want that. But let's say that this can happen. When I talk to physicists, they don't see any reason why we can't arrange the atoms in such a way that they do much more effective computations than humans can do. And it's obvious, I think, to everyone now that progress is accelerating. This is not just commercial hype, although there is a lot of that. But within the field, I talked to many of my contemporaries, and we've all had what we might call holy cow moments, where we see some piece of progress that we simply didn't expect would be possible at this stage, and we're taken aback by the rate at which things are moving. So one reason for this is that the theoretical foundations of the field are now pretty solid, based on rational decision making and statistics and understanding how perception and language works as inference from evidence. And people like Zubin have made great contributions to this progress. So with those theoretical foundations, it becomes possible to build cumulatively, something that we never saw in the early days of the field. In the first 20 years, it was very rare to find one paper that built on the previous work of maybe more than 2 or 3 predecessors. But now there are layer on layer on layer of theory, and that's advancing the practice at the same time. So in applications such as speech recognition and vision, reinforcement learning, the deep learning techniques, which have been gradually refined from ideas that existed 20 years ago, but with those tweaks, all of a sudden have started working very well. We've seen really dramatic progress on those core problems. We now have ways of describing probability models of arbitrary complexity using universally expressive languages that can essentially anything that can be written down in any language can be written down in one of these languages concisely. And we're starting to understand one of the most important problems for intelligent decision making, which is how do you make decisions over long time scales where your plans will involve millions or billions of individual primitive physical actions, but yet you would like to be able to plan over those kinds of timescales. I sometimes give a talk called Life, Play and Win in 20 Trillion Moves. 20 trillion is roughly how many things you do in your lifetime. You don't think of it that way because you don't think at the level of individual muscle activations. But that's roughly how many things you do in your lifetime. So we've seen all these very high-profile public successes. Probably the first really big one in our memory was the victory over Garry Kasparov by Deep Blue in '97. More recently, just a couple of months ago, one version of poker was won by a machine beating the best human players. And the DeepMind system, so DeepMind, now part of Google, developed a reinforcement learning system that uses deep learning to represent the value function that it learns. And the input to the system is the screen of an Atari video game. So 640 by 480 pixels. And that's it. So it opens its eyes, it's born, it opens its eyes, it sees above its crib, as it were, a video game. And within a few hours, it learns to play that video game at a superhuman level. And it does that for over 30 different video games. If that was your baby in the crib, and in the evening of the day of its birth, it was playing most of the Atari video games at a superhuman level, you'd be perturbed, I think. So the subject of perturbation appears the gentleman on the left. This is the final of Jeopardy, which is a quiz program. It's not anything like Mastermind or one of the good British quiz programs, but it's something. So Watson, which is a system built by IBM to play this Jeopardy quiz game, and the quiz game, it's actually not it's not trivial. It's not just factual retrieval. It's sort of like a slightly bland version of a cryptic crossword. So there are lots of puns and tricks and so on in the way the questions are posed. And Watson has been trained to understand it turns out there are about 110 different categories of Jeopardy question in terms of the way the question and the answer are logically related to each other. So in addition to having to have encyclopedic knowledge, which it's extracted automatically, it's not a database that's been created by hand. All this is extracted from text that it finds on the web. So it's able to perform substantially better than the best human players, who are very intelligent, well-read, learned people. Some of them have even been Berkeley professors. And so the gentleman on the left saying, I, for one, welcome our new computer overlords. And some of you will have seen the progress that's been made in self-driving cars. And I'll just show you, assuming it works, a little video. This is footage from Google's car, which drives itself around the world. And this is the typical kind of image quality that the system deals with, and yet it's driven almost 1 million miles now without any serious accidents. Okay, so this is actually my colleague Peter Abiel's robot And you'll see in front of it a pile of towels. And you can actually, if you have your laptop handy, you can go on the web and see the video. Just type in robot towel folding. So it picks up one of the towels and it looks around, tries to find out where to grab it. When it knows it has the corners, and then it goes over the table and folds it up very nicely. So it can do, basically it can start from a big tub of laundry, put it in the washing machine, run the cycle, take it out, put it in the dryer, run the cycle, take it out, fold it all up and put it back in the basket. So it's really quite impressive progress. If only I could show it to you. So this one's not a video, good. So this is a fairly new task in machine learning, which is to take images and produce a caption for the image. So it's sometimes called automated captioning. And so these are trained again from millions of images that humans have captioned on the web. And then you give it a new image and you ask, what should we call this? And the system comes up with a group of young people playing Frisbee. Right? So when you see this kind of thing happening in systems that have essentially been trained with very little manual structuring or programming, then this is the kind of thing that causes people to have the holy cow moment. Let me talk very briefly about some work in my own group that Zubin mentioned, the global seismic monitoring. So this is a map of all the places where nuclear explosions have taken place. So there were 2 of them in Japan in 1945 over there. They killed about 200,000 people. And then all the rest have been tests, or also in the Soviet Union there were so-called peaceful uses of nuclear explosions, where they used them to dig canals or large underground caverns and things like that. Not a very successful enterprise. And all in all, the tests killed another 100,000 people from radioactive fallout. And they also nearly caused several wars. Here's a little picture of the crater from a fairly small nuclear test. The biggest nuclear test was 500 times the size of this one. So nowadays we don't think too much about nuclear weapons, but they are still a very serious concern for the countries around the world that have to deal with them. So there's a treaty, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, or CTBT, and it bans testing of nuclear weapons on the Earth. And it's a very strong treaty. If there is convincing evidence brought to the Council of States, then they can essentially invade the country in question and occupy a 1,000 square kilometer area and look for the smoking gun of a underground explosion chamber. And unfortunately, the US proposed this 57 years ago and has not yet ratified the treaty that it itself proposed. That's an embarrassing situation, I would say. And the claim was, so when President Clinton tried to get it through the Senate, his opponents claimed that it wasn't verifiable, that we didn't have good enough detection mechanisms to prevent other nations from cheating with clandestine explosions. So the UN has built a very large network of stations around the world, most of them seismic stations for detecting the vibrations that are produced by explosions. And this turns out to be a very difficult problem because the Earth produces things that are as big or much bigger than nuclear explosions hundreds of times a day. And also people can try to cloak the nuclear explosion using various clever techniques so that they appear much smaller than they really are as seismic events. They can set off 2 nuclear explosions, one right after the other, to produce something that produces the same radiation pattern of seismic signals as a natural earthquake, and so on. So it's a very, very difficult problem. And so I bring this example up to show you the value of having the kinds of universal probabilistic languages that have now emerged in AI. So within a couple of hours of learning about what the problem was, we could use one of these probabilistic languages, and here's the program that we wrote in this language. And this is essentially the solution to the problem. So this describes the physics of the occurrence of seismic events. I don't expect you all to read it and understand it, and there's not going to be a test. So it describes the physics of how seismic or nuclear events occur, how signals are propagated, how they're detected, the kinds of errors that are made, the kinds of noise processes that exist in the Earth. And so what we do is we write a large probability model like this. We provide as evidence the signals from all the seismic stations around the world, and then we simply ask the question, what happened? Right? What events took place? Where did they take place? How large were they? And the system answers. It gives you its best explanation for the observations that are provided. And this chart shows the failure rate of the current system, which for different magnitudes ranges between 30 and 50% of the events that occur, the real events that occur, are actually missed by the current automated detection system. And applying the model that we just showed, we were able to get this down to about 10% or 11%, and we're pushing that down quite a bit further right now. And this is a picture of the North Korean test that took place in 2013, the terrain of the test site. There's a tunnel down here, so we know that the North Koreans drilled a tunnel here, and so the explosion probably took place somewhere in the vicinity of that black cross. This is the estimate from our system, and up there is the estimate from the combined expertise of most of the world's geophysicists plus the UN automated processing system. So the point is that what used to require the work of possibly hundreds of people, I mean the UN system is over $100 million just to develop the software part of the system, and they've been trying to solve this problem for about 103 years since the first paper was written on seismic localization. So in the space of just a few months from learning about the problem, we had a system working substantially better than what was available, simply because the field of AI had produced tools that were sufficiently expressive to simply describe the problem and solve it in an almost mechanical fashion. So another thing that's going on, and I'm sure it hasn't escaped your notice if you have any students with any computer skills, is that it's very hard to keep your students at the university because they are being stolen at a rapid rate. And industry is investing probably more in the last 5 years than governments have invested since the beginning of the field. So the rate is really astonishing. And the reason is very simple, that in several areas, and I've listed some of them, we're starting to see performance that in the lab has grown fairly steadily, and perhaps recently has accelerated somewhat, but to us in the lab it looks like continuous progress. From the outside and in the commercial world, it was completely invisible because it was not at the level where they could sell it. As soon as it crosses that threshold, it begins to exist. And then you create this virtuous cycle of feedback. You create a market, and then once that market exists, there's value in further improvements in the quality of performance because you can charge more and you can enlarge the niche of the market, you can find new applications, and so you invest more money. And you get a cycle that happens on a completely different scale of speed and the magnitude of research funding that's provided. So I think we're going to see, we've already seen this in automated vehicles, but I think we're going to see this in domestic robots and intelligent assistants. These will be the two, after self-driving cars, these will be the two new big areas where AI will have dramatic impact for ordinary people's lives. Okay, so having said all this, then we get to the question of what if we succeed. And I.J. Good wrote a very pithy article that included this very famous sentence: "The first ultra-intelligent machine is the last invention that man need ever make." And the reason is that, of course, what we have as human beings is because of our intelligence. We're not particularly strong or fast or scary, but we are relatively brainy, and that gives us what we have as human beings. So if we have more of that, if we have machines that we can use to amplify our intelligence, then we can solve all the rest of our problems to first approximation. So we have very positive outcomes that could come from increasing the power of AI. And this is the vision that drives most people in the field, that it's not just as Lighthill put it, that we're frustrated men who are unable to have children, and so we build robots instead. It's that AI could, humans with AI could do wonderful things that we couldn't do unaided. So he also went on then to, of course, make the other famous point that an ultra-intelligent machine could design even better machines. There would be an intelligence explosion, and the intelligence of man would be left far behind. So that's usually the part that's quoted. He does go on to say, it's curious that this point is made so seldom outside of science fiction. So even then he was complaining that the field of AI and, shall we say, the serious people were just not paying attention to what he considered to be a really important problem. And just to come back to that metaphor of driving off a cliff, he's saying, look, you are on a road, the road goes straight, you can see that the road goes off a cliff somewhere up ahead. Why are you continuing, or shouldn't you just think about maybe changing direction? So there was a recent article that I think Max Tegmark initiated it, but it went out with several of the CSER advisory board members as co-authors and appeared in the Huffington Post. And it included these two sentences. And I think, I don't think the first sentence is an exaggeration. The other interesting thing is that this sentence has now sort of gone into folklore almost. So when I was in Geneva, I was surprised to hear the ambassador from China actually quoting this in his opening speech in the UN discussion on a potential treaty to ban autonomous weapons. So this is we're not going to get any more scaremongery than this, right? The point is a very simple one. How do we make sure that that road does not take us off a cliff? So given that it's this important, I would say that there hasn't been enough serious thought. So I made a little thought experiment. Suppose that we got another candidate for biggest event in history would be if we were visited by a superior alien civilization. That would be a pretty big deal. So we get this email. It says to humanity@un.org, we'll be there in 30 to 50 years. Okay, and what do we reply? Well, we send them the out-of-office auto-reply. Right, this is sort of the state. This is the current situation, right? The field of AI has sort of just said, yeah, whatever, which is an odd reply to these concerns. Part of the problem is that there is a lot of non-serious stuff being written. So here's a quote from the normally very sensible and serious Harvard Business Review. In 2014, by 2025, these machines will have an IQ greater than 90% of the US population. What on earth could that possibly mean, right? Right? So they don't have an IQ. Machines don't have an IQ at all. it's not like they have a small IQ. They don't have an IQ at all. The concept simply doesn't apply to machines. A machine can be world chess champion and totally unable to play checkers. In fact, they are world chess champions and totally unable to play checkers. So, and the notion of IQ is the entire point of it is that, generally speaking, there's a high degree of correlation between a person's ability to do one intellectual task and another, and that's why it makes sense. Some people argue that no, actually we have to have 7 IQs, but for machines it would be, essentially infinitely many IQs. You'd have to have a chess IQ, a checkers IQ, a writing French IQ or writing English IQ. Every single task, as we currently understand how to make those tasks work, is done separately and has no bleed over into any neighboring tasks. And this is one of the reasons actually why the deep mind result was a little bit more impressive even than you might think, because it really does learn lots of different games from scratch and do them all well. And the games are quite different. Some of them involve shooting, some of them involve driving, some of them involve batting things backwards and forwards with paddles, and yet it's able to deal with all of them. So it's an early sign that generality is possible. Another thing you'll see a lot is predictions based on the awesomely increasing power of computers. And the problem is that the word power is being used in order to make the sentences true. It's being used in a very simple technical sense of the number of floating point operations per second per dollar, or something like that. And indeed, that number is increasing quite rapidly. But the problem is when you start putting various kinds of brains on the y-axis and say, well, in this year, 2029, we'll exceed the human brain, and 7 years later, we'll exceed all human brains combined. That starts to be completely ridiculous, because at the moment, our programs are pretty stupid at almost everything. And giving us machines that are 1,000 times faster would just make them produce stupid answers a lot quicker. So I exaggerate slightly, but it wouldn't really constitute the kinds of qualitative breakthroughs that we need. It wouldn't get us anywhere towards the completely new structures of reasoning and learning that we would have to have general intelligence. So I propose that we just ban these kinds of diagrams altogether. Another non-serious thought that we're getting a lot from journalists is, if you raise this issue, it must be because it's urgent, it's imminent. I've had people tell me, I have to stop my research right now. Because whatever I do, and if I put my hands on the keyboard, I'm putting the human race at risk. It's not like that. It's not right around the corner, and it doesn't have to be right around the corner for there to be a reason to be concerned. Right? You don't have to be right on the edge of the cliff for someone to say, well, you are driving towards a cliff. You sure you want to do that, right? You don't have to be right at the edge before someone's allowed to say that. The other thing is that, as I'll illustrate in a minute, it's very hard to predict the breakthroughs. So although I don't believe it's imminent, I can't say it's going to be at least 50 years either. It's very difficult to figure out when these breakthroughs will occur. The point is, if there's a non-negligible possibility, and this is sort of the mantra of CSAR in general, right? That it doesn't matter whether the risks are small, if they're non-negligible and there's a serious argument that they're not vanishingly small, then it's certainly worth trying to figure out how large is the risk, when is it likely to be serious, can anything be done? And this is true for climate change, for asteroid impact, and for AI. And I think the sooner we do something, the better. Many articles about this just seem to be an excuse to pull out the old pictures of Terminator robots. It doesn't matter what I say. I could issue a press release with a blank sheet of paper, and then people would come up with a lurid headline and put Terminator robots in the picture. But armies of robots, actually, this is not what people are talking about. That isn't the danger. And if you think about it, right, you know, when humans have done terrible things to the world, they've done it by speaking, right? They've done it by convincing lots and lots of people to do things that upset lots and lots of other people in very serious ways. And so you can have impact on a global scale simply by having an internet connection and therefore, you know, access to 3 billion screens. Another thing you see a lot is that, you know, we don't need to worry about this because, you know, the only problem arises from machines spontaneously becoming malevolent, and that couldn't, you know, why would that happen, right? We design the machines. They're not, you know, we're AI people. They don't become spontaneously malevolent, so we can simply ignore it. Well, I mean, yes, spontaneous malevolence is a ridiculous idea, and some of the stories about how the risk could arise seem to involve this, and many movies, of course, involve it. But actually, the risk comes from competent decision making, which is, so it's not that there's some evil guy in his garage, or as in Ex Machina, in his weird Patagonian retreat, developing something without thought about what he's doing. This is the goal of the field. Right? Our goal as a field is to make better decision-making systems, and that is the problem. That's why I'm saying that the road appears to lead off the cliff if we just follow it as we're currently doing. So let me try to explain why the road appears to lead off a cliff, and then talk about what we could do about it. So the problem with AI that gets better and better is that it gets better and better, and what it wants to do is not what we really want done, right? If it was what we really want done, then I suppose we wouldn't complain, and so we might complain that we have nothing left to do. You know, we're all going to sit around watching reruns of Survivor or something like that. But obviously, if a system is doing something that we don't like, and it's much, much smarter than we are, then that seems like a problem. I put asterisks by we because obviously there isn't a single we. There are lots of us, and we all want different things. I put asterisks on the word really because it's actually very hard to figure out what we really want, and that's part of the problem, right? You're going to build a super intelligent machine. You have to give it something that you want it to do, right? And the danger is that you give it something that isn't actually what you really want because you're not very good at expressing what you really want or even knowing what you really want until it's too late and you see that you don't like it. And all the fields that study better decision making pretty much take the objective as something that comes from the outside, and we're going to study how to optimize it, but it's entirely up to you what it is. Right? And this is sort of almost a religious precept of utility theory that it can be anything as long as it satisfies the right set of axioms. We'll treat it as a utility function. And I'm arguing that that's a fundamental mistake that we can't make. So many people have made these kinds of arguments. Nick Bostrom in particular has done a good job of collecting them together and making them very persuasive. He has the paperclip example. Marvin Minsky had the calculate pi example. You could even have something as innocuous sounding as cure cancer. And if those goals are given to a super intelligent machine without it really understanding all the rest of human values and how, in fact, this is not an absolute goal, but there are lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of trade-offs that have to be made, which a human would naturally make, right? So the human naturally understands that when you say, I want you to cure cancer, you know, eliminating the human race in the process of curing cancer isn't what, in fact, you really want, right? And same with make paperclips, right? So we don't want the whole world to be covered in paperclips. We just want enough paperclips, you know, to do what we need to do in terms of clipping paper together. So this is a very old story, right? So King Midas had exactly this problem, right? He didn't specify what he wanted correctly, He said, I want everything I touch to turn to gold. He got exactly what he said, and then he realized too late that it wasn't what he wanted, and he could no longer eat or drink and died a miserable death. And we all know what happens with a genie, right? You ask for something, and by the time you get to the third wish, you just wish to undo what you did in the first two wishes because you misspecified your goal. And this is it recurs over and over and over again in mythologies. So if you specify an objective for an intelligent system that isn't exactly what you want, there's this extra argument that Steve Omohundro pointed out, that for any goal you give a system, in order to achieve that goal, one of the things it has to do is to make sure that it doesn't get switched off. In fact, that's the most likely, if you're a superintelligent system, the most likely reason for failing in your given mission is that someone switches you off. So you're going to take precautions to make sure that can't possibly happen, right? So this is one argument. And then the other one is that you can increase your probability of achieving the goal by acquiring more and more financial or physical resources to carry out the task. And I think the Transcendence movie does a good job of illustrating these points pretty well. So it describes what it's like to see an intelligence explosion happening in a system that basically grabs control of lots of money and resources and figures out how to defend itself extremely well. So if you combine that with value misalignment, now you have a superintelligent system that's doing things that you don't like, and it's extremely good at defending itself, and it's acquiring all the resources that the rest of the human race might want for something. So this is obviously a problem, right? So this is your kind of 2001 Space Odyssey problem, where HAL doesn't want to do what the humans would like. So if you think about it just in terms of an optimization problem, so the machine is solving an optimization problem for you, and you leave out some of the variables that you actually care about. Well, it's in the nature of optimization problems that if the system gets to manipulate some variables that don't form part of the objective function, so that it's free to play with those as much as it wants, often, in order to optimize the ones that it is supposed to optimize, it will set the other ones to extreme values, right? And so in a simple mathematical sense, the problem is sort of inevitable unless you have an approximation to the objective function that's pretty good and pretty complete. Another pretty obvious problem, so besides just how do you make sure the system does what you want, is that these systems are in principle going to be difficult to analyze, right? I mean, they're in the standard thought experiment, they're already smarter than you. So how can you figure out what they're going to do? Because if you could do that, you'd be as smart as they are, right? Which you aren't. And also, there's a lot of difficult technical questions involved in software. We're used to doing formal analysis of software that's fixed. We write software that doesn't overwrite itself. We prove it doesn't overwrite itself, and then it's sufficiently manageable that we can actually verify that it satisfies certain properties. But here we have to allow for the fact that the systems could, since they're smarter than we are, they can program just as well as we can. They can build new versions of themselves that are more powerful and then program those. And so this takes you into areas that are far beyond what we really understand how to handle in computer science. So my proposal is that we should stop doing AI in its simple definition of just improving the decision-making capabilities of systems. We should add some extra adjectives, right? Eventually, these adjectives will disappear into the word AI. Just as with civil engineering, we don't call it building bridges that don't fall down, right? We just call it building bridges. Of course, we don't want them to fall down. And we should think the same way about AI. Of course, AI systems should be designed so that their actions are well aligned with what human beings want. But it's a difficult, unsolved problem that hasn't been part of the research agenda up to now. Okay, fine. All right, so how do we make them? Again, I put asterisks because, in some sense it's almost oxymoronic to put provably in beneficial, because beneficial is a vague term. What does that mean? And since we don't have a precise meaning, how can it be provably? Okay, let me just go over some of the ideas that people have proposed. So one of the first things that would occur to you is to say, fine, right? If the problem is that a system can act on the world, on a global scale and affect things in ways we don't like, let's simply take away the capacity for action altogether, right? Put it in a box, right? So it's a very natural thing. If you have a tiger, put it in a cage, right? That seems like a natural response to this problem. So we seal it off. We don't connect it to the internet, and so on. But you have to connect it to something, otherwise it may as well not exist at all. So, so people have proposed making systems that only can answer yes or no to questions. And I see Eliezer nodding that yes. And there have been lots of arguments showing how systems that, even limited in this way, can still cause you arbitrary amounts of grief. So I'm not going to go into those details, but one point is that, so even if it's provably a question answering system that provably gives you either yes, no, or probability answers to questions, it still has to have the ability to control its own computational behavior, right? So in some sense, it's still a real agent at what we call the meta level. So it still has to have the ability to decide which computations to do. And I think if you take away that ability, then you're probably taking away the ability to be a super intelligent question answer altogether. I don't know that for sure because no one's really thought about it very much. But if you do have an agent at the meta level, then you may be just replicating the same sets of problems that you try to avoid. Another approach might be a kind of a stepwise progress. So if it's really difficult to be sure that a proposed design for a super intelligent agent is safe, then perhaps we could build if we have some pretty good idea of how to make super intelligent decision-making systems, then we could probably make super intelligent verifiers, right, whose only job was to look at the designs we're proposing and say, yes, this one is safe. If you deploy this, it will not be a disaster for the human race. Okay, that might be so. Then there will be a kind of a stepwise. You would improve the verification technology, and that would allow you to deploy a new generation of agents, and then you would keep kind of leapfrogging one over the other and make progress that way. That might work. I'm not sure. But it's an open question as to whether the problem of verifying that an agent is safe when it's a system of that can achieve decisions with quality X, is that verification problem actually easier than making a system with that decision quality in the first place? And we don't know the answer. There's a lot of questions that just ought to be answered, and I think many of these probably can be formulated mathematically and solved precisely. So at the moment, we talk about intelligent systems having goals, like it has the goal of making paperclips, it has the goal of defending itself, and so on. This is all just words, right? Is there an objective sense in which we can take a machine and say this agent implemented in this machine has a particular goal, right? As yet, there's no answer to that question, right? It would seem like a pretty sensible question to try to answer, and I think it can be done. There isn't really an answer to the question, is this agent better than that one? we would like to understand questions like, can we be sure that this agent design will never overwrite the goals that we provide? So if we do figure out the right objective or goal to give it, and we can prove that, in fact, yes, it does have those goals, can we prove that it can never overwrite them with something else? Right. This would be not easy to do right now, but I think it's the kind of thing that with accumulation of mathematical results, we could get to the point where this is quite feasible to do. So my own inclination right now is actually to work more directly on the problem of value alignment. If misalignment of values is the root cause of the difficulty, then perhaps we can just get systems to have values that are sufficiently well aligned with those of humans. So there's a concept called inverse reinforcement learning, which is a reinvention of something in economics called structural estimation of MDPs. And what it means is sort of the inverse of reinforcement learning. So reinforcement learning means that you're given rewards depending on how well you behave. And then you learn to behave in such a way that you maximize the sum of rewards that you receive. Okay? And there's pretty good evidence that this is both effective in practice. It's the method that DeepMind uses to learn the Atari video games. There's also evidence that a lot of human and animal learning actually follows this general pattern. So inverse reinforcement learning is the opposite of that. So here we're observing a behavior, and we're trying to figure out what reward function or what objective function is that behavior trying to maximize. Okay? And so I would argue, in fact, that although we certainly have learning mechanisms for our values as humans that are based on the reward functions that are built in by nature, pain, pleasure, and so on, I think that it's also the case that a lot of what humans do as they grow up and learn value systems is actually inverse reinforcement learning, that they're acquiring a value system sort of directly from other humans by sort of reverse engineering how everyone else behaves, how people react to that behavior, and so on. So there's now a fairly deep literature on inverse reinforcement learning, plenty of theorems showing that, you know, in such and such circumstance, these algorithms will, after a certain amount of experience, learn to behave nearly as well as the agent that they're observing, or learn an approximation to the value function of that agent that gets arbitrarily close in the limit. So those kinds of theorems exist. So, you know, what you would like is that, you know, your household robot watches you struggle out of bed in the morning and do funny things with little round brown bean-shaped objects and a very noisy machine, and then something that makes steam and so on, and then you put this brown stuff in your mouth. So you want your robot to understand that, yes, coffee is something that's good for people to have in the morning. You don't want the robot to want the coffee, right? So we don't want the robot to learn the values of the human in the sense that it takes on those values itself. Right? What we want is that it wants to maximize the value that humans have. It actually doesn't care about itself at all. Right? In fact, the right way to think about it is that the robot has no desires whatsoever. Its only desire is that the outcomes that it brings about are ones in which the human is happier. So we'll call this cooperative inverse reinforcement learning. So in game theory language, we want to learn a value function for this multi-agent problem where the Nash equilibria are the ones that maximize the payoff for humans. And when you start out, the robot doesn't know what the human payoff function is. Okay, so, you know, being Bayesians, we can put a prior over payoff functions. And when you have a very broad prior, then there's a question about what should the robot actually do before it's learned what humans want. And my intuition is that it should basically not do very much, right? It should stay in the background and watch and learn, maybe ask questions, maybe do some cautious exploration of our preferences. And so risk aversion in the agent's payoff function seems to help with that. But there has to be more than that, right? There has to be some belief that doing nothing is somehow safer or better, than doing any other real physical action. And that has to be just a bias because, from the point of view of game theory, all actions are a priori just tokens, action 1, 2, 3, 4. One of them happens to be the do nothing, and there has to be some bias that makes you prefer doing that. So there's still some questions there I don't quite understand. I'm happy to discuss that if people have some ideas. And so the goal then would be to analyze these kinds of systems, these multi-agent systems, and show that in the limit, the total loss that the human might experience as a result of having this robot in the world is not great because the robot doesn't do much until it has a pretty good idea of what the human wants. So, hopefully it learns fairly quickly that it's fine to, pull little children out of the street so they don't get run over by buses and things like that. But, it perhaps doesn't initially know whether to intervene in a fist fight between two adults or something like that, right? So, so the idea would be that with these kinds of priors and risk aversion, that you could bound the loss to the human to something fairly small. And so clearly it depends on how well you approximate what the human being cares about. But it also intuitively seems to depend on how smart the agent is. And this is the part that's really puzzling, right? Our intuitions tell us, from watching science fiction, I suppose, that when the agent is super intelligent, when it's really able to optimize payoff over an arbitrary long horizon and take into account essentially all possible available information and do all the Bayesian calculations correctly, that an error in the payoff functions is somehow potentially magnified, that it could result in much worse things happening because you have a really, really capable agent. And so there's a question about how fast does the error in the payoff have to go down as the intelligence of the agent goes up in order for not too bad things to happen. So it seems like a very interesting set of questions that at the level where you could find a really, really bright PhD student or postdoc and actually, turn these into things that concrete enough to actually do research on. So there are some obvious difficulties, right? So if you then sort of go away from the idealistic world of computer science academic papers and say, okay, Mr. Professor, so are you really proposing that by these algorithms you will be able to have machines that over time, by observing human behavior, learn a pretty good approximation to the values of what we might call an admirable human being? It's a very difficult question, right? So clearly, one of the obvious problems, and inverse reinforcement learning addresses it only a little, is that humans don't behave rationally according to some single consistent utility function. They have multiple means of choosing how to behave. They have reflex, impulsive behaviors. They have deliberative behaviors. They have parts of their brain from early evolutionary periods that respond to very crude stimuli in very crude ways. So there's a very complicated system of decision-making subsystems inside the human brain. And we're also fundamentally computationally limited, so we can't behave rationally. So just think about a chess game, right? So you observe a human. The human actually is trying really hard to win the game, but being unable to consider all 10 to the 55 possibilities, makes a move which eventually turns out to be the one that lost the game. Well, if the system is really smart and observes that move, it shouldn't infer that actually the human was just trying to lose at that point, right? Even though that's in fact what the move was succeeded in doing, right? So the computational limitations of the human are absolutely fundamental to understanding how we behave and inferring what we're trying to do. So you can do actions that don't achieve a goal and still be trying to achieve that goal, and that's how it should be interpreted. There's obviously questions about the fact that individuals and cultures have very different values and what should be done there, and also the fact that we're not really individual decision makers. I mean, our preferences are shaped by evolution and society, not to benefit us as individuals, but the preferences are there to some extent to make sure that our species or our kin group or whatever it is, our genes, get propagated and survive and succeed. So we act in ways which moral theorists look at and say, well, that's clearly irrational, right? For example, the preference people seem to have for alleviating local suffering rather than suffering on the other side of the world, even if the suffering on the other side of the world might be much worse. Well, yes, I mean, if you're thinking about an individual decision and just looking at the consequences of that one person's decision, that seems wrong, that they should devote more resources to, poor little puppies in their hometown than someone who's starving to death on the other side of the world. But if you think about how everyone in the world behaves, right, if everyone in the world found the one person who was suffering the most and gave all their money and resources to alleviate the suffering of that one person, that wouldn't work either. That would be total disaster, right? So this sort of locally apparently irrational behavior may be sort of optimal or better on a more global scale. So it's not clear that we should even analyze the values of individuals because they may not make sense. Okay, so why do I think this is a positive idea? One is I think that we have time to do this, and we have lots and lots of information, right? Almost everything we write, almost every movie, every newspaper story is about people doing things, often to other people, often against their will, and there are lots of reactions of people recorded, and so presumably a system that was able to be super intelligent would be able to solve this cooperative inverse reinforcement learning program from this massive amount of data and come up with a reasonable approximation to what we might think of as an admirable set of human values. The other reason I'm optimistic is that there's a good, solid economic reason for solving this problem long before we reach superintelligent systems, which is that if a system doesn't have the kind of common sense about what humans do and don't value, for example, a domestic robot, might well notice that the fridge is empty. It's supposed to feed the kids before mom and dad get home from work, and decides to put the cat in the oven for dinner. And that only has to happen once for the domestic robot industry to basically be eliminated. So there's this really strong economic incentive to get the value systems of things like domestic robots right. Okay. So when I say this kind of thing to people, there are a number of responses, and I'm sure that there are other people in the audience who've been saying these kinds of things to AI people, and we get a range of responses. A common one, it'll never happen. This is the argument that it's fine, we'll run out of gas at some point before we go off the cliff. And I usually like to quote a little incident from history. This is Rutherford, very good. And so on September 11th, 1933, he gave a speech to the British Association for the Advancement of Science. Anyone who looks for a source of power in the transformation of the atoms is talking moonshine, right? And this was not a one-off comment. This was something he said over and over again in newspaper articles and interviews and and speeches and so on. And this particular comment was reported in the Times the next morning and read by this gentleman, Leo Szilard, and he got so annoyed by that he invented the nuclear chain reaction. So we went from never to about 17 hours. And so I'm not ready to say it will never happen. And a few years later, this is what Szilard wrote in his notebook. So we switched everything off and went home. That night, there was very little doubt in my mind that the world was headed for grief. So he had just demonstrated a sustained nuclear chain reaction that was observed with scintillometers and so on. And one of the reasons the world was headed for grief was because they were doing this work in the context of an arms race with Germany and then later on with the Soviet Union. And it was too late at that point to think about how you might control this technology, how you might make sure it was only used for peaceful purposes, and so on. They had no choice but to go ahead and produce weapons. And interestingly, so H.G. Wells wrote about atomic bombs in 1913. He didn't quite get the technology right. Instead of going one enormous explosion, his bombs made an ordinary explosion-sized explosion that continued for several weeks instead of all at once. But he had the rough magnitude of the energy about right, which was already known. So my view is I don't want to come home and write that in my notebook, and nor does any other AI researcher want to write that in their notebook. So I think we have to solve this problem of control. The sooner we solve it, the easier it will be. It might turn out that it'll be easy. That will be great. Just like the people who worry about asteroids, they could take out a few envelopes and figure out, oh yeah, fine. We just need this kind of rocket and this kind of propulsion system and this kind of explosion to deviate the asteroid, and anything up to 200 miles in diameter, we can easily, that would be lovely to have that kind of outcome. Then we could all just go back to doing AI. But so far, no one's really thought of a clear and easy solution to this problem. Inevitably, there will be more and more pressure, both from commercial interests and military interests. And military interests are maybe much less constrained by this public relations problem of putting the cat in the oven and things like that. If their systems work 61% of the time, they're pretty happy. And they have a different utility function from most of us. The other thing is it does take a long time to do this kind of stuff. So if you look back at, I don't know whether we need a regulatory framework, a legal framework, treaties, that systems have to be certified before they can be released, that kind of stuff. But if you look at how long it takes to go from, for example, horror over chemical weapons to an actual treaty, horror over biological weapons to an actual treaty, it seems to be on the order of 60 to 70 years. And I don't think we have maybe we have 60 to 70 years, I don't know, but I wouldn't be too sure. Another response is, well, it's too late. This is George Bush's response to climate change so having denied that it existed, he then moved to it's too late to stop it. So I hope not. A version of that is, well, there's nothing you can do, right? This is research, and you can't pass a law saying that certain types of equations shall not be written on whiteboards, right? That can't possibly work. And really, the breakthroughs that we're thinking about, it's not, creation of a disease organism with certain kind of DNA or anything like that. It's really mathematical equations. It's understanding that these breakthroughs are composed of. And so it's a little more difficult, but there is a very successful precedent, which is what happened in genetic engineering. So in a workshop in 1975 held at Asilomar, which is a retreat in California, there was a very conscious decision that even though the whole purpose of understanding genes, or one of the main purposes of understanding genes, had been the hope that we might be able to make ourselves better, that we might be able to understand how we're constructed and improve that construct to eliminate defects, that there was a very conscious decision that by going that route, we would end up with a society that we probably wouldn't like. Right? We might be happy in it, but from this vantage point, it doesn't look like society that we want to get to. And so they had a ban, a voluntary ban, that has various kind of enforcement mechanisms, and it's been pretty successful. That as far as we know, there have been no sustained heritable modifications to the human genome, even though that's been feasible for a long time. It just became a lot more feasible. One of the main things was that you can't get FDA approval for any medical treatment based on such modifications. There's a new method now called CRISPR, which is a much more accurate and straightforward technology for modifying the genome. And there was another workshop held earlier this year where they went back and said, okay, let's revisit this question, because one of the original reasons for not wanting to do it was the risk of producing people with very serious deformities or other kinds of genetic problems, not understanding well enough what you would produce. Now I think people have a very good grasp of how to do the editing, and they can be very precise. They revisited the question, and by and large they decided that we still want to keep this ban in place. I think it's a much weaker right now, and there are some groups in China that deliberately went ahead and started doing some experiments. But I think the consensus will hold, but it may need some more exhortations. It's a little different also because in the medical field in general, right, just like civil engineers automatically know that bridges are not supposed to fall down, right? They don't have bridge design and then making sure the bridge doesn't fall down people, right? It's just the same person, that's what they do. And the same is true in medicine. That's just part of what you do, that work in medicine is designed to be beneficial to humans. There is an asterisk on pervasive because there's a subculture, which is the synthetic biology sort of garage hacker subculture, which deliberately takes the opposite view, right? That we should be able to do anything we want, and any kind of constraint, whether it's voluntary or legal, is anathema to our ethos as independent inventors. I'm not sure I agree with them. Okay, another response is very common, and particularly common because the people raising a lot of these concerns have been outside the field of AI. Well, you don't know what you're talking about, right? You're just Luddites. You're just trying to stand in the way of progress. And we all know what happened with Luddites, and that Luddites were wrong, right? We talk about all those silly people who said when the automobile was invented that it would result in carnage on the road, that thousands of people would die. I mean, what idiots, right? Actually, no. Certainly my goal is not to stop AI research, and I don't think that's the goal of many of the people. It is the goal of some of them, but I think for the most part, they want to just make sure, they want AI to happen. Right? Because of all the good things, even some very far out ideas about what AI might do for the human race in the positive direction, those things can't come about if these questions are not addressed. So we want to allow AI to continue because it can be very beneficial in lots of ways. We have to solve the problem first, right? We want to change the field so that it feels like civil engineering or like nuclear fusion, right? It's easy to achieve the goal of nuclear fusion. If you said the goal of nuclear fusion is to produce unlimited amounts of energy, right? Just like unlimited amounts of intelligence, then wow, they succeeded in 1952. Right? They created a hydrogen bomb explosion, unlimited amounts of energy, right? More than we can possibly use. But it wasn't in a socially beneficial form, right? And now it's just what fusion researchers do, right? Containment is what fusion research is. That is the problem that they work on, right? The part about generating energy will just sort of follow once they figure out the containment problem. So this is what we want for AI, right? And we should stop calling it ethics of AI and putting it in a separate workshop and sort of imagining that there's someone who's going to go around looking over people's shoulders and checking on what they're writing and making sure it's ethical. This is a total non-starter as far as having a real impact on the field. So I'm happy to be talking at a time when progress seems to be moving in the right direction. So thanks to some of the people here in the room and some other people. I should mention Jan Tallinn in particular, who has been pushing this area and with his own resources for quite some time. There was a conference in Puerto Rico organized primarily by Max Tegmark, which brought together some of the mainstream AI people, some influential decision makers in the field, some people such as Elon Musk and Pierre Omidyar and others who have expressed a strong interest in this and wanted to understand more about where things were going. Was this the right time to intervene in the way they're uniquely qualified to intervene? And I think they decided that yes, it was. So out of that conference came this open letter called Research Priorities for Robust and Beneficial AI, which lots of people signed. Within a week, we had over 6,000 signatures on that letter. And then a few days later, Elon Musk announced his donation of 10 million to FLI, the Future of Life Institute, which is at MIT and Harvard. And that money is now in the process of being given out through a competitive grant process. So we're moving along, and so actually looks yes, all these things happened just in January, right? And then AAAI, which is the main professional organization for AI, for a long time had a very strong position that ethical and political issues were not part of what a professional society should be concerned with. That this was a scientific society and these were not scientific questions, and therefore they weren't really interested in having any official position. That seems to be changing rapidly. There's now a AAAI committee on ethical and societal impacts, and we had a debate on autonomous weapons in particular at AAAI this year, and we may move towards a vote by the professional society actually taking an official position on that topic sometime later this year. So I think that from a situation where, even 5 years ago, the mainstream AI community just didn't take this question very seriously. There was a task force that Eric Horvitz put together when he was president of AAAI that sort of took a look at the question. You might say the committee was stacked because it didn't have anyone on the committee who had ever raised any of these questions. It was really just mainstream AI people who do regular AI research. And they pretty much dismissed, they said, yes, this is worth thinking about, but we're going to dismiss it. Right? There's nothing really that's worth paying attention to, and everyone should just move along. That position, I really think, has changed dramatically, and it's because, I think, not because people have suddenly seen the virtue of the arguments. I think they've suddenly seen that AI is really making progress, and they've thought about it themselves and said, oh, yes, okay, we are moving forward, we are probably going to move along this road, let's have a look and see where the road goes. So, so in terms of this rate of progress, I think we are going to reach, unless we choose not to, we're going to reach human level AI in some sense. And fortunately, maybe not too late, the field is changing the way it thinks about what it's trying to do to move away from this pure goal-independent notion of intelligence to incorporate the purpose into the definition of what we try to do. Okay, I'll stop there and take questions. Thank you.